Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome back to Sarah Lawrence. Welcome to Reunion. Thank you so much for coming to hear this insightful and thought-provoking talk by Professor Leah Olson on the biology of living and dying. Leah came to Sarah Lawrence in 1987. That makes this your 25th.
I guess I hadn't thought about that either until I got here.
Her special interests are in the neurobiology of circadian rhythms and in the neurobiology of living and dying, learning and memory. This spring she taught general biology 2, organismal and population biology, and topics in cell biology. Leah's courses, including psychoneuroimmunology and the biology of living and dying, are among the most popular courses on campus. That's not surprising because Leah engages her students in research that leads to important answers about metabolism and the regulation of eating, obesity, aging, and other basic functions. Leah's bachelor's degree is from Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, and her doctorate's from SUNY Albany. Please welcome Leah Olson.
And I'm going to start out by apologizing and having to say something about, I actually was debating between whether to do a talk on the biology of living and dying or doing a talk on psychoneuroimmunology. That title you probably didn't understand, which is about the interconnections between mental and physical health, right? And so what I have to apologize for is today I'm experiencing this week I have been my end of the semester illness. I have been sick all week, and so you can probably hear my voice might be a little clogged, my ears clogged, and I might cough a bit. I'm feeling much better, but I'm still not completely over it, so just to let you know. And I could have talked about that if we were going to have the psychoneuroimmunology talk, why at the end of a semester, when your stress is finally over, you can relax, and I'm sure you've all experienced something very similar. You relax, you think, wow, I did all my work, I got everything done, now I can have a good time, and boom, you're sick, right? I won't say anything more about it right now, but there are some interesting ways that connect to the talk that I decided on, the biology of living and dying, right? And to just give a little more background and so I have a little problem with breath, so just have patience with that. That led to this course that I developed called the Biology of Living and Dying, was that I had become, the biology department had really been working on ways once we got here in this beautiful new building, not so new anymore, it still feels new to me, however. We really wanted to try to develop more research opportunities for students. In the old building that we had occupied and had been there for many years before I came, there really were not laboratory facilities available for research, and we now have them. And as we, nonetheless, doing research at Sarah Lawrence is still really hard, right? As you can imagine, maybe now more as you're an adult than you did as a student, teaching is a full-time, it's a time-and-a-half commitment to the faculty. Right, so there's a question of where to find time to do research, even if you have the facilities. So one way we thought we might be able to facilitate that, and it seemed really consistent with the way that we tried to teach our subjects as well, which was in a very interdisciplinary way, not to teach isolated subjects, but to try to show how each specialty subject relates to the whole breadth of the questions of biology, was that we tried to think about developing a research question that could be approached from many different levels in biology. So, for example, a question that could be approached from an ecological level, a question that could be approached from a neurobiological level, a question that could be approached from a genetic level. We've never fully succeeded in doing that, but we got a little ways in that my ecology colleague did anyone of you take biology while you were here? Oh, so maybe some of you know he was here much longer than me. Right? He's actually retiring this year. Ray Clark. Does that mean
Madeline Gray.
Okay. He's just retiring this year. And in his research, which he did during the summers, he would go to coral reef sites in the Caribbean or in Belize and study these tiny little coral reef fish called madeleines. They're about this big, right? And they live in these little holes in the coral reef. And what he had discovered, they have to drink fairly often too, what he had discovered was that there were these two species of these coral reef fishes, and that they were stratified along the reef, right, where they were located. And he realized that there was always one species sort of at the bottom and extended a ways up the reef, and then from that point on to the rest of the top of the reef, there was another species. And he wondered about that, right? Why does one species like this region and the other species like this region? And we're talking about maybe 8 feet, right? So it's not a big change from the bottom to the top, but it seemed like one species preferred the bottom and the other species preferred the top. So he thought, well, do the simple experiment and take one of the species away, right? So he removed one of the species from the bottom, and they were fine. They stayed on the bottom. He removed the species from the bottom, and suddenly the species from the top moved to the bottom, right? They preferred to be in the bottom, so they must have been in some way restricted from being able to get into the top region. He was working with some of the students that he would sometimes bring down to the reef. His student discovered that one of the species moved its gills in and out a lot more often than the other species moved its gills in and out. And as Ray looked at it, he thought, well, there's a metabolic difference between these two fish. Same size, very closely related species, and when they did the measurements, they indeed found that one of the species had a metabolic rate that was twice that, almost twice that, of the other species. Right? Well, that was really quite remarkable, because we tend to think that metabolic rate varies with size, right? So then an obvious question is, why? Why does one fish have such a higher metabolic rate? Well, it turned out to be the fish that was successful in getting what seemed to be the more desirable lower slots on the coral reef. And so he did some fighting studies and found that, in fact, yes, if you set one against the other, the coral reef fish on the bottom is really much more aggressive at fighting, and that probably explained why I was able to outcompete the other species and get the more desirable position. Well, I thought those were all really fascinating observations, and Ray was interested, but his questions were really located in a slightly different direction, so he hadn't really pursued that. And it occurred to me that that would be a really interesting kind of behavioral study, because my background is neurobiology and behavior, to get students interested in. And between the two of us, we decided we could. He had brought some of these fish home occasionally when he was studying them, just to have as a house pet. You know, set up an aquarium and kept these fish that kept hidden all the time. You didn't see them very often. And I just heard from one of his retirement party comments, you know, that his children, his daughter and son, would always have to explain to the friends that they brought over that this was indeed a fish tank that had fish in it, but you know, they didn't see them. So that we would he would go for the summer, come back with a big bag of fish for me, and my students and I started working with those fish. And right about this time was when the hormone leptin was being discovered. How many of you know about the hormone leptin? A few of you do a little bit. Okay, well, this was a huge breakthrough in the biology of understanding, initially at least, regulation of eating and an understanding of metabolism in general, right? Just to give you a little bit of background on how leptin was identified, it was identified in 1994. The gene for leptin, I should say, was identified in 1994. This was really the culmination of many, many, many years of research. In much earlier, an obese mouse, a genetic strain of an obese mouse had been discovered, right? And that was thought to be a real breakthrough in and of itself, because if we can show that there's a gene that affects weight regulation, we'll finally be able to get to the answer of understanding issues of weight regulation, a subject that was impenetrable to research for many, many years. Well, that optimism was soon sort of discouraged. They looked and looked and looked and could not find a way to understand the actual genetics of this obese mouse. Right? They knew there must be a gene for it because it was a genetically inbred strain, but this was a time when finding genes was still a very, very difficult thing to do. Right? And it really took the work of about 20 years by a New York researcher at Rockefeller before he finally isolated the gene. Excuse me. And that gene was then discovered to be a hormone and was located in fat cells, right? So suddenly, not only do we have a major regulator of weight, but we now have an idea of where it's located. It's in fat cells. And so the idea here is that there's a hormone that is in fat cells that increases in quantity as that fat cell becomes bigger. That hormone travels to the brain and says, there's plenty of fat in this fat cell, you no longer have to eat. So without that signal, these rats would become obese.
You mean there's some genes that are only in one kind of cell? I thought all genes were in all cells.
Yes, but they're only activated in
expressed.
Fat cell.
Okay.
Yes, you're right. So that they're active in the fat cells, right? That's where you find activity of that gene, right? So this again was thought to be a breakthrough, a discovery. What was even more of a breakthrough, in a way, was that once they isolated the hormone, they could then purify it, synthesize it, and now inject it back into these obese rats, right? Previously, the rats were so morbidly obese that they would only not eat themselves to death because they could no longer stagger over to the food bowl. Really, what kept them from eating themselves to death was immobility due to how much they weighed, right? They were insatiable. And when they weren't eating, they were doing nothing, right? They just sat. Most rats like to exercise. They want a running wheel. If you give them a running wheel, they voluntarily spend a lot of time exercising, right? These obese mice, rats. Also, I've been saying rats. They are mice. Sorry, they're mice. There's a similar rat we now know about that these were mice when they were first discovered. So there were two things that seemed to be at work: an insatiable appetite and sort of a distaste for exercise. Right? You might think the two things go together, but in fact, as we'll learn, they don't necessarily go together, but they seem to be regulated together often. Right?
Maybe you'll get to it, maybe not. Did the obese mice, did they start off exercising and then stop once they got fat, or they never liked it?
They never really liked it. Yeah, so that's a good way to try to say, is it a consequence of their obesity or is it a separate factor? But you inject them with leptin, they now voluntarily stop eating so much. They now voluntarily get on the running wheel and start running, right? And they actually drop down to normal size. So Jeffrey Lieberman, Friedman, who discovered this, before it was published in Science magazine, signed a contract with a pharmaceutical company for a few $1 million, right? And everybody thought we finally got a cure for obesity. Well, not so simple, right? It turns out that only maybe a half a dozen, less than 10 probably, people in the whole world have currently been identified that have a defect in their leptin gene, and that's the cause of their obesity.
Does that relate in any way to Prader women?
No, but are you a geneticist or?
No.
No, there are as we now know, there are many, many genes that have as one part of the symptoms that occur with the genetic disorder, obesity, right? There are many, many determinants of obesity, right? And it certainly happens in Prader-Willi, but it's in a completely different gene, right?
So there's no way of controlling.
There's no really of controlling that. So the pharmaceutical companies lost out, although I think they're finding ways to make back some money. I think they're finding some ways to still use leptin. It doesn't help a lot of people lose weight, right? But they're still looking for ways that they can maybe make it an effective hormone. And it's important to note that that not only did the injections cause a voluntary change in eating, but it was also promoting exercise, right? That the two seem to again be regulated together. So leptin was identified in a mammal, in a mouse, and I had these fish in my hand, in our thing now. So I thought, well, let's look for leptin in fish. And so I first started doing some library studies, and sure enough, like about 3 months previously, one little study said, hey, we found some leptin in fish too, right? So I thought that would be a really good way to get started in this fish, to try to identify leptin, to try to identify leptin receptors in their brain, and to try to just, sort of start exploring what we could. Because this fish had never been studied anatomically, we started by having to put together a brain atlas, right? So we really had a lot of fun doing very detailed and fairly time-consuming studies, and that is really what got me interested in, questions of metabolism, which is a fascinating, fascinating field, right? Let me step back from that then a little bit and start talking about how the class that led to these studies then evolved. So then I started doing a lot of reading on metabolism, a subject I knew a tiny bit about. I had to study something about the regulation of eating in one of the classes for my neuroscience degree. I knew it was a mess, right? No one could ever figure out anything. But I knew a little bit of the sort of very quick and dirty answers that people would give. They're really dirty. If you start looking at them in any detail at all, it would all fall apart. It was really mostly smoke and mirrors. But I somehow so I thought it was interesting. But I've also been noticing a lot of really interesting studies coming out in the field of aging. And I didn't know much about aging at all, but I knew that it was a really deep biological question. And doing courses on really simple but deep biological questions is something that's always really attracted to me, because they seem, by being deep, they're also very general, right? And students are often surprised to learn that some of the most simple observations about living organisms are some of the most challenging. And this is true for sex, for example, right? I had done a course previous to quite a while ago now called The Biology of Sex, because sex, the fact that most organisms reproduce using sexual reproduction, is a frustratingly difficult question to answer. Why? Why is that the choice of reproduction, right? And ways that animals reproduce end up having a huge impact on just about every other feature of them as an organism, right? So it's really a deep and also very general question. And aging had the same sort of flavor. Everybody thinks they know why organisms age, right? Why do we age?
Bodies wear out.
Okay, wait, let's get a few of these questions.
Yeah, our bodies wear out.
Our bodies wear out, of course. Things wear out. What else?
Oxidation.
Oh, well, okay, that's a mechanism for why we wear out, right? How we wear out, right.
Is that like inflammation?
Inflammation. So these are all mechanisms, that cause aging, that cause the wearing out. Like, our cars start rusting as they get old, right? Also oxidation. Maybe a metallic form of inflammation too. Who knows, right? But to ask that kind of question in biology, you have to go a little bit deeper and say, well, why should aging happen, right? Why should wearing out happen? And first of all, the question about wearing out doesn't really hold up very much if you start looking at biology very deeply, right? Physical things wear out. Should living things, just by analogy, also wear out?
Since they're
Is there any-
self-renewing, right?
They're self-renewing, right? I have a cell in my body, or I did, right? I had a cell in my body that I got from my mother, right? My parents. I sent a copy of that cell to my daughter and to my son, right? If they decide to reproduce, will do the same. Those cells are immortal. Those cells have found a way to never wear out, right? So our assumption that organisms should wear out, because when we look around us, we see the physical world wearing out, really doesn't hold up. In other words, wearing out must then be a choice, right? In other words, we're not wearing out because we have to. We're wearing out because we must choose to. And when I say we, I don't mean me individually. And when I say choice, I also don't mean conscious choice. I mean that over evolutionary time, those that seemed to be the solution that worked best, right? So
That's true.
So, right. Did someone have a question?
No,
we're going to go further into that, but I wanted to.
I'm
there's
wondering
another
about the religious
thread that I
aspect.
want to try to build in here.
One of the readings talked about Moses' lifespan being
Yes.
the ideal one, and I thought about how that is, I mean, over time.
Over time.
It's changed, but 120 years.
120 years. Yeah, our increased life expectancy, that's getting at a question of the difference between life expectancy and lifespan. They're two very different things, right? The lifespan may not have changed. In other words, humans have always been able to live to 120, given the best of all possible circumstances, right? More of us are doing that today than did 100 years ago, but the lifespan itself has not necessarily changed, right? Therefore, the best that we could ever expect with biomedicine is to, have more of us living to that older age, but we can't expect to live 150. We're going to find that may be challenged now too, but
But it's not only living, it's not only humans that age, it's animals also.
all animals also age, right? Okay, so I wanted to throw in. Go ahead.
A couple of things. Don't certain cells in the body simply just deteriorate, like egg cells. I mean, you're born with a certain number of eggs in your ovary, and
Right.
they're nice and fresh and wonderful when you're in your 20s and 30s, and when
Right.
you get to be in your 40s or
Right.
your 50s, those eggs do break down
Yes.
and deteriorate, and you do have
Sure.
effective children. But when you live to a certain age, are you really prolonging life, or are you really prolonging the period of dying? Are you getting to the point? What you're doing is, to a person of 100,
Right.
the quality of life
Yes.
would be so diminished
Right.
that, in a sense, is that person really living a life, or is that person just
Right.
forestalling
Right.
his ultimate
Those
shutdown
are-
of all of his
right.
systems?
Those are great questions. And one of the things that really intrigued me about the study of aging is that it also came with all of these really deep ethical questions tied to it as well. And that's another, sort of feature that I think is really important to incorporate in a topic. So I'm going to step back a little bit from that, from that a little bit, because I wanted to bring in a few other threads before we really get into the story. And I also, how many of you read the handouts that were given to you? I didn't realize that those were being given.
I didn't get any
Oh,
handouts.
okay, right. Okay, so good. We have someone who read them. But I was going under the assumption that you hadn't. So if I'm repeating some
Where
of
were they supposed to come from?
I don't know.
Where
It came on the, oh.
I those are handouts that I had used earlier in the year. I did Faculty on the Road, and I just didn't think about it for this lecture. Wasn't asked for papers, so I get very efficiently to be assigned the same papers, but I didn't know that, so I came with the assumption that people hadn't read it. But it's fine either way, it really doesn't matter. Maybe you'll be interested enough to read them later.
Where are they?
You can get it.
We'll find a way to get them
I
to
think
you.
there's a link from the web page of the reunion web page.
Oh,
I remember
could be.
going through that.
Okay, yeah, they're both,
Yeah,
they're
but
both
it's a
in the
Google
mobile.
Doc.
I didn't see it.
It's a Google
Right,
Doc.
okay. I wanted to talk just a little bit more about the history of the study of aging, and because there's some interesting threads to sort of bring in here, and then we are going to get to the second half of the title, the living part also, very shortly, or tie back in that story about obesity and discovering the obesity gene. So we'll get there.
Yeah, it seems to me we've skipped over the very interesting question is why it works out better that we die at the
Yes,
end.
no, we're going to be getting into that. That's, of course, the
I mean, I
key
have a
question.
theory, but.
No, that's great. So let me just tell you a few things, and then I want to hear what your theory is. Okay, so previous to a really more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the theory of natural selection, there were a lot. Well, first of all, let me step back even further and say that for a long time, the study of aging wasn't of interest to the scientific community because they made the same assumptions you did. Things wear out. That's not what you're interested in. You want to look at things that are working, right, and understand how they're working. Who cares about things wearing out? So the scientific community really hadn't paid much attention to aging. But aging, or at least immortality, had been a real interest for most people from the beginning of time. Right? And in most cultures, there are immortality myths that try to give people an idea of how they might live a good life that will maybe permit them an immortal life. Right? So there was
Sucking
a
blood being a
link.
vampire.
What?
Sucking blood being a vampire. That's how it
Oh,
works.
well, I unfortunately missed out on some of those the sort of new cultural icons, I guess. But often the two were combined. A good life means a longer life, possible immortality, right? And they had certain ways about defining a good life too. You know, what was a good life that might extend your days and maybe give you the possibility of immortality. Usually, slow down, live more gently, don't expend a lot of energy. A lot of this could be tied to breathing, like in some of the Eastern meditations, that if you reduce the amount of energy you waste in passions, right, you might achieve a state of immortality. Really consistent themes in many of these immortality myths was reducing passions because they were wasting energy. So there was this idea of energy lurking around in many of the immortality myths. And a few of the biologists who did get interested in looking at aging were really just trying to look at the variation in aging that you see among organisms, right? You know, we know that humans live, as we say, to possibly 120. In the best possible conditions, a mouse won't live more than 3 years. In the wild, they'll die probably after 1 year, shortly after a year, but in a zoo or kept in really great conditions, no predators, the best food, they don't have to be stressed for any reason. Even then they die, right, at about age 3. You can't get them to live very long at all. So why? Why is there such a difference in how long different organisms can stay alive? So they were interested in that question. And some of the answers that they came up with made a lot of sense according to some of these mythologies. Because if how many of you have pets like a cat? Ever noticed its heart rate faster than yours? Quite a bit faster than yours. Right? Started realizing that there's a really nice linear relationship between heart rate and size. The bigger you are, the fewer heartbeats you have. The bigger you are, the longer you live. Hey, wait a minute. This is just like all the myths said. If you live life more slowly, you can live it longer, right?
Or if you're bigger, you can
Okay.
exert your influence over the same.
Okay, that's a really great point. That's not the only reason big animals live longer, and that was really maybe one of the mistakes that was made. But there's this really beautiful correlation when you look in nature, right? And if you do metabolic rate, you find a similar correlation, right? Larger animals, slower metabolic rate, live longer. Small animals, high metabolic rate. That's why they have a higher heart rate, right? Sustain that high metabolic rate. And it really seemed perfect. It was called the mouse to elephant curve, right? In later years, they looked a little beyond mammals. To it, it seemed like it held up even when you looked outside of the group of organisms we call mammals, right? So it seemed to, which are a really tiny segment of the living world. Mammals aren't a whole big piece of it, right? So to extend it, they wanted to look further, and there seemed to be some feeling that it was consistent among other organisms as well. So this was sort of great, you know. It's related to energy, right? That again really made sense because of all our, you know, we're sort of embedded in a culture that looks at energy as something sort of, you're given a certain commodity of energy, right? You've got given, when you're born, you have a certain amount of energy, and when you use up that energy, you die, right? And you can use it up fast. You know, talk about a candle, burning a candle on both ends. You know, it's often caution people, you know, not to waste their energy is often, is coming out of that sort of feeling that energy is a limited quantity that we have been given. And it's somehow related to how long we have to live, right? So there seems to now to be emerging, you know, some biological evidence that was consistent with that, right? And that's a piece that I'm now going to leave to the side again, right? I'm going to try to bring all these pieces together before we finish, but there are a few different pieces that I want to sort of put out there. So now the evolutionary biologists start becoming much more sophisticated in thinking about, you know, how the features of organisms can be explained by evolutionary theory of natural selection. And they started looking at aging. And I was surprised that none of you answered my question to you about why aging happens. I'll give you another chance. So we've got the one answer here. Things wear out. What's another answer you may have heard?
Slightly, not quite answering that question, I'm not sure, but more about why we die. I mean, am I cheating if I answer why we die? Or is
Well,
it
no, what was here?
well, we have to, because people are being born all the time.
Okay. Boom. Got it.
Say
Got
that
it.
again, I didn't hear.
We have to die.
Make way for the new.
Big way.
Yeah.
The next one.
We have to make way for the new.
Overpopulation.
Right.
Overpopulation.
Right. So that seemed like a perfectly acceptable evolutionary answer, right? That the new have to have resources, the old have to move out to give those resources for the energy needs of the new population. Ties to energy again. There's a limited amount of energy in the world. And the new won't have enough access to that energy if the old keep around too long, right?
It's in the labor market too.
Yeah. And that sounded both right, and it also sounded like it had an element of humanity to it, right? You know, I'm more willing to die if I think I'm doing it for someone else's good, right? Should I be willing to die for someone else's good?
That's the Christian way, right?
It's a Christian way. Is it the way of evolution?
No.
No. Right?
Well, for
That's
the
a
species, maybe.
misunderstanding of the theories of natural selection. The good of the species, I don't care much about the species. I care about me. Right? And who are you going to talk into dying? Are you going to talk me into dying for your kids? Forget it. Right? Maybe I'll die for my kids, but I'm not dying for your kids. Right? So that answer doesn't work very well. And so when the more sophisticated evolutionists got into the game, the answer became much more puzzling. And in fact, there's this very famous biologist, sort of a polyglot biologist, who wrote also books that were for the popular press. So he was a Nobel Prize winner, and he had a gift to sort of sort of summarize, I guess, the issues. And he said the last great mystery of biology is aging, why things age. This was about in 1950 when he said that. So he and other gifted biologists sort of put their mind to the problem of, okay, we've got to figure out why aging happens. We know that it doesn't have to happen. We know that organisms don't have to wear out. We've got lots of evidence in the natural world that things don't have to wear out. We can restore living organisms. When we're kids, we do that much more quickly and easily than we do when we're aging. How much more quickly you can heal yourself if you get wounded when you're 10 compared to when you're 60. Right? Even a minor scratch heals more slowly when you're older. Why? You know, what made that switch? So there are two ideas that were proposed. And both of them could have parts that are correct. They both probably aren't correct in their entirety. And this is what often happens in really puzzling questions, is that there may not be one simple answer. There may be a few different things that are sort of coming together. One idea, something with a very complicated name that actually isn't so hard to understand, is called negative or antagonistic pleiotropy. I'll write it on the board. It's not important that you remember it, but just in case you want to. Pleiotropy is a genetic term and refers to the fact that a single gene may have many different effects on the physiology or anatomy of an individual. One gene often doesn't restrict itself to a single feature, right? An example of that is like cystic fibrosis, right? We understand that there's a single gene for cystic fibrosis. We understand exactly what it does. It disrupts the ion flows across cell membranes. But when you look at someone with cystic fibrosis, they have lung problems, they have kidney problems, their fingernails have strange shapes. You know, there are many ways that affects their body, even if it is a single gene, right? So that's saying that genes are pleiotropic. They can have many effects on the body. Negative pleiotropy is saying that a gene that does something good for you may have a negative side effect, right? In other words, maybe it's good for you when you're young. Then as you age, maybe it's doing something less, you know, that somehow it's doing the things that are associated with aging. An example of that might be testosterone, right? It's one that they looked at. Testosterone is good for young men, right? It also probably accounts, at least in a small part, to the fact that women live longer than men, right? Men die at faster rates from the time of conception, right? So there's all kinds of reasons why males aren't surviving as well, and it could be to some extent due to testosterone. So we keep it the way it is. However, we still have testosterone in males because it has such a beneficial effect on reproduction, right, that it's worth the fact that it causes them to die a bit earlier. So that's the concept of negative pleiotropy. There's something that really helps us grow and reproduce when we're young may cause us to die as we age, but it's worth it, right? So there's a benefit to the early effects that we're willing to take that cost of not living forever. So again, I'm not dying, you know, for your kids. I'm dying because it's given me the only chance I have to reproduce, right? So another idea, so that's one of the ideas. Another idea was called mutation accumulation. And this was actually by that same Peter Memoir that I mentioned before. And his idea was looking at some, as we learn more about genetic disorders, you know, there's some of these genetic disorders that were at first very puzzling to geneticists because they're dominant, right? A dominant genetic disorder means that if you have even one gene, you've got the disease, right? And if it's a gene that causes the disease, then it's dominant. usually it's very quickly eliminated from the population. If it's bad for you and you express it, you're probably not going to have as many children, or so, so you're going to, that gene is going to be very quickly eliminated. So to find a dominant gene that causes disease and that persists in the population is very puzzling. And one example of this is Huntington's chorea, right? Do you all know Huntington's? I'm sure, no? It's a neurological degenerative disease, right, that causes, Woody Guthrie had Huntington's disease. Absolutely no treatment for it. It doesn't begin to express itself until about the age 40 or so, and then it's just in inexorable decline to a very, very horrible death, right? Why hasn't evolution gotten rid of that gene?
Because it
I
only
gave you a
starts
hint.
to strike.
It only starts to strike after you've reproduced, right? So genes that cause us to age and die will only, will learn over evolutionary time to express themselves after you've reproduced.
But that's sad because you pass the gene on to your
You've already passed the gene
heirs.
on. So basically we've inherited all these aging genes, not because they're doing any good for me or my kids. It's just that these genes got pushed through natural selection. They got pushed to a point where natural selection can no longer affect them. They're silent to natural selection. So it's just a fact of how natural selection works, is that we push all the deleterious genes to the point that they don't express themselves until after reproduction has occurred. There's no way for natural selection to get rid of them. So this sounds sort of right. Now we're getting away from trying to think of, is there a benefit to aging, to what more like we always thought about it. It's a damn shame, right?
Are we seeing a decrease in the numbers of a lot of these dominant genetic diseases with the advent of more prenatal testing?
That's a great point. I mean, you would expect to.
I would imagine you would, wouldn't you?
Except that I don't, that's another really deep question. So are you going to try to, so you get rid of a fetus that you had that carried this gene that might not affect them until they're 50 years old. They might be able to live a normal, happy, productive life. Woody Guthrie.
Well, that's whether to get rid of it is a philosophical question
Right.
or a religious question. But if one were looking at it from a biological perspective,
Then you could, right?
then a woman who wished to reproduce herself,
Right.
can choose to
Right.
reproduce herself
No.
with the elimination
Right.
of that gene. From
You
a purely
could,
biological
if
perspective.
this is really true, if the genes that cause us to age are all here, right, because they've been pushed to this point, and we can identify them, we could select against them now, right? We could potentially do that. And that's one way we could achieve human immortality, is by weeding out all those genes that have collected here. Much harder to do here, right? Because the genes have a benefit early on, and only later on have they again here. Yeah, that's great.
Or the flip side of that is if we could affect the receptor messenger gene that turns that gene on
Right.
at the age of 40 or 42
Right.
and prevent the gene from being expressed.
Great point, yeah.
That would be a more
Right.
more fruitful area of
Right.
research that would not involve loss of life, just a way to, I assume people are working on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So these are both really productive biological theories now that are really starting to sort of make the question more clear anyway. But there's one other.
I was just going to say there's some medications that were proven beneficial, but over a prolonged period of time, like Fosamax
Yeah,
for the bones,
right.
that they advise against
Now
using
they
it.
say,
It's helpful to begin with. I mean,
But-
I was on it
that's
about
right.
8 years and then told to get off,
yeah,
and now I'm not on anything.
Right.
But-
yeah, no, that's true.
And so some of the medications, I think even like Lipitor or some of the others have side effects
Right.
with mobility and other things.
They're now
that-
questioning.
and they're not, a lot don't know about the side effects that can be destructive At the same time, they're helping another problem, and I think they're starting to look at things a bit differently than what they had.
Right. Well, and the Lipitor is a really great example, and maybe we can come back to that. Too. What? It's a cholesterol reducer.
Yeah.
Inhibitor.
What's the,
It's a
There are a lot of studies
statin.
on cognition.
So if you have high blood cholesterol, you've given them. They're now questioning whether to give them to everyone over age 50 should be taking these.
I just read
That's
something
really-
else
yeah.
about that.
That's
But
really
everybody's
impressive.
going to benefit from taking statins, whether they have high cholesterol or not. On the other hand, there's another study that says women taking statins have higher incidence of stroke.
Yeah.
And
So,
cognition.
but there is this idea. I mean, that's a really interesting question, and I think we'll be able to get back to that too. You know, because coming out the other side of the aging research are all these clues that are letting us get into, if not this, then others. Well, let me just sort of. Did you have one more
Well,
question?
no, I was just going to say when you said something about, I just came from the Milton conference, and they talked about medications. They had the head of NIH, they had the head of Pfizer, and what have you, and what they were talking about. Each one in the past had gone their own ways. They didn't want anybody to know what they were working
Exactly.
on, and what they're doing now, they're trying to bring everybody from every resource together, and even patients. When you said, "Not for my children," I'll do it for my children.
Right.
But to have them involved in the drug testing, not let the pharmaceuticals
Yes.
choose who they test with.
Yeah, that's
If you
really
get
critical.
involved, your problem might become that of someone else's as well, and you're helping generations
Right.
and your children and grandchildren. So they're looking at things a different way
Right.
than what they used to.
Right. So there's one other piece of the aging sort of theories that I want to get into, and then I'm going to quickly bring it to the molecular studies that are really starting to identify genes, and that very, very nicely begins to tie back to the earlier studies on metabolism and regulation of eating and so forth, right? So the last piece of trying to figure out aging from the sort of evolutionary point of view was another person who went back to this idea that we do have some cells that are immortal, right? There are germ cells. They're the cells that we pass on to the next generation, right? And also he thought about the fact that different animals have such different lifespans. And when he started thinking more carefully about this idea that we can totally explain why different animals live a different amount of time by looking at their metabolism, remember that mouse to elephant curve? He said, you know what, that doesn't always hold up, right? I mean, think about a bird, for example. Birds have extremely high metabolisms, and yet they can live for a very long time, right? So that we conveniently left birds off that mouse to elephant curve. And so he started looking a little more closely at some of the assumptions that were being made that were built off that idea that fits so nicely with all the mythology that we collected and, burn a candle at both ends and stuff. It said, that sometimes works, but there's another reason why big animals maybe live longer. That's what you said, right? And that might also help us explain why a bird lives longer. Why does an elephant live so long? Another reason why an elephant might live so long.
It doesn't have a predator.
How can who's gonna get into a tough with an elephant? Right? How does that relate to a bird?
Well, there are
It
things
doesn't
that
have many predators either because they
viruses
fly
can kill
away.
big things. I mean, so that falls apart quickly. A virus can kill a great whale.
Yes, yes, but to explain the difference in lifespan, right? A virus is going to maybe, and those organisms can get everybody. But to explain why a bird lives so much longer than an equal-sized mouse, right? If your little mouse is running around in the field, how long do you think you're going to make it before you end up at someone's dinner?
And probably the bird's dinner.
Maybe even the bird's dinner.
Yeah.
Not very long. So he started looking at a different way. we can make a choice to make a cell live forever. Would I want to give that mouse the possibility of living forever, put a lot of energy into making him live forever, when he's going to get eaten in a year anyway, right? Maybe if we do have a limited amount of energy, not because I was given a certain amount of energy, because I need resources to keep me alive. I'm eating those resources. I'm getting what I need for my energy by eating. Now, what am I going to do with that energy I derive from what I've eaten? Am I going to put it into making myself healthier and stronger, or am I going to put it into making offspring, right? So I can really get that immortal cell going, right? And so, why should I make myself healthier if I'm going to get eaten anyway? So only put enough energy into keeping the body alive for an amount of time you could expect to live, given the environment that you live in. Right? If you're a bird living in an airy environment, sure, build in a long life. You can expect to live a fairly long time, or a human, or an elephant. Right? There are many organisms that can't expect to live more than a few weeks. Put all your energy into reproducing in a huge blast and then die. You've done the work.
We expect to live a long time, we may not reproduce.
And there's a real relationship between when reproduction occurs, how often you reproduce. Ecologists have known those relationships for a long time, but they hadn't
I wish I
ever
could reproduce now.
brought them.
Is that what we used to call live fast, die young?
Exactly, right. Yeah, that was in fact taken from the guy who first did the mouse to elephant curve. And in fact, there are some other sort of anomalies associated with that idea that you've got a certain amount of energy, and if you waste it, right, you won't have it to help you live longer. Is that what do we do when we exercise?
Burn energy.
Yeah, I think of the Edna St. Vincent Millay poem, I burn the
candle
candle
on
at both ends.
That's right.
It will not last the night, but
That's
all
right.
my friends and all my friends, it gives a lovely life.
That's right. That's exactly right. But when we exercise, burning lots of energy, but isn't exercise good for us?
Doesn't energy reproduce itself and make you more energetic?
It sometimes seems to do that too. So there's all kinds of contradictions here, and that's what the field is trying to get to the bottom of. And the exercise piece is a really interesting one, and I want to get to that too. So he's now got this, what he calls disposable soma meaning body. I can throw my body out, right, as long as I have my immortal cells living on. Right? Natural selection doesn't care about me living forever. It cares about whether I can get some cell in my body to live forever. I'm going to put my resources into where I think they can be more are more likely to live longest. And that's in reproducing, not in building a body that's going to live forever. It's often referred to as sort of the manufacturer's warranty, right? I mean, why do you want to build a car that lasts for 50 years? Why does it, why do you want to build an appliance that works forever these days? You don't. You're going to give a warranty for the amount of time you think that machine is going to last. And that's all, right? So your warranty more or less tells you what you can expect in terms of the lifetime of your appliance. Right? Why make it longer than that? You don't have any interest in doing that.
No, because then you can sell another one.
Yes, exactly. Right.
That would be very good for the environment.
Yeah, right.
That's something I learned.
What?
It's just cute that I learned planned obsolescence is what it's. I learned that in
Planned-
class. Sarah Lawrence, I mean.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Built-in obsolescence.
In this building.
Exactly it. And so that's sort of what natural selection has done with living organisms too, right? Why waste energy building a body that can live, that could potentially live for much longer than you'd ever expect to survive because of the environment that you live in? Right. So now.
Well, I keep waiting to hear something about the fact that when cells divide, each time they divide, they lose a chunk of their telomeres on the mitochondria,
Right.
because every replication is not a perfect copy of what went
Right.
before.
But, so those of you who might not know what a telomere is, how many of you know what a telomere is or not? Okay, at the end of chromosomes, there is sort of like plastic wrap. right? Every time a chromosome has to reproduce itself, it can't do so all the way out to the very end. And so every time a chromosome divides, it loses a little bit, right? And to make sure that when it loses that little bit, we're not going to lose anything efficient, that's important, they more or less just put a lot of junk DNA there. So now when the chromosome shortens, it's not going to cause any problems. And so that sort of junk DNA is called a telomere.
Until you get to the end of your telomere.
Until you get to the end of the telomere, now you're in trouble again, right? And so as people age, if I were to look at the telomeres of the older of us in the room, our telomeres would be shorter than those in the younger end of the room. Right? Telomer. They're complicated. I'm going to get.
Well, yeah, they are.
They come in and out in terms of their popularity and in terms of being able to explain aging. They're gaining a little more popularity right now. There's been some interesting research on them, but they never end up panning out quite. Because, and again, we're getting at the question of why. We could build telomeres longer. We could build a replication process that doesn't lose the ends of our chromosomes, right? Okay, so the piece that's going to finally bring us back to the eating part is at about the same time, some geneticists wanted to get into the game and say, okay, let's look for some genes for aging, right? We've got all these techniques now. Let's look for some genes for aging. And most of the biological community said, you're nuts. There are no genes for aging, right? I mean, we just spent all this time convincing you that aging is sort of this haphazard, that you're, in a way it is true that your body's wearing out because natural selection has built a genome that doesn't want to last for that long. You're not going to find a gene for aging, right? Or even 2 genes or 4 genes. That's not the way they approach the problem. So it's very hard to get funding. And finally, one sort of maverick researcher, Cynthia Kenyon, who is at San Francisco, very delightful, still very young-looking woman, not so young in age, I think, anymore, but working on this little organism called C. elegans, which is a genetic model system. C. elegans, for those of you who don't know, is a little called a roundworm, kind of little tiny worms that live in the soil. Some are disease-causing, most aren't. Microscopic, you don't really see it. If you pick up a pile of dirt, you won't really see it. If you put it under the microscope, you'll see them. So very, very tiny organism, way down on the phylogenetic scale. Said, I'm going to look for a gene for aging in C. elegans, right? And lo and behold, she found a gene, right, that she said caused an extension in the lifespan of this little tiny worm. And that was sort of not looked on favorably, again, by the biological community as well. This is ridiculous. We're not going to listen to this kind of story. She continued to work away, found not just one gene, but other genes, and they all end up being part of what we call signaling pathway. Signaling pathway is when one cell has to communicate to another cell or listen to a hormonal communication. It does so by activating a receptor on the receiving cell that then turns that into a message that the cell can use to cause changes inside of it. Right? So how it does it is called a signaling pathway. It's often quite complicated. So every gene that she was finding was in the same signaling pathway. Right? So that really started making sense because you isolate 4 genes, they're really all doing the same thing. Slightly different stages in the pathway, but still all the same thing. What was this gene? She finally was able to identify what this gene was. Insulin receptor. Okay? Insulin receptor, or a variation of it in this very, very basic animal, an insulin receptor. Right? And so that suddenly got everybody really excited. Right? For one reason being that the only thing minute, how did I? Wanted to do this a little bit differently, but let's, for the purposes of trying to condense this a bit. When I started talking about how I got to the course I was given, I started by telling you I was, sort of been interested in metabolism, but also very interested in aging. To just backtrack a little bit, I then ran into a former Sarah Lawrence student who spent her life as a vet and now has a biotech company of her own. And she said, you got to teach a class on obesity. It's really interesting. We're learning so much about it with the discovery of leptin, et cetera. Teach a course on obesity. And so I was really torn between a course on obesity or a course on aging. I thought, well, I'm finding the aging literature fascinating. How's that going to go over with a student group of 18 to 21, Maybe they won't be as interested as I am in this question. They'll probably really be interested in issues about weight, right? So probably that's what they want. And then I thought, well, if only I could find a way to do them together. And I realized that there was a link, right? And I didn't realize how powerful this link was, but that link, and this is why people started pricking up their ears to Cynthia Kenyon as well, was that there was one known way to extend lifespan of organisms. That had been known since about the 1930s. No one really understood it, but we knew that I could extend the lifespan of just about any organism, lifespan now, not life expectancy, lifespan, right? And that was caloric restriction. So I thought, great. I wrote up a little blurb because I was under pressure to get it into the catalog, and I didn't really know how well I was going to be able to make this link when I started it. And this is what, really caught the attention of aging researchers when Cynthia Kenyon finally said, insulin receptor. Was that, oh my God, right? Aging, caloric restriction, which we've never been able to understand. Now we've got a link that might help us understand why should caloric restriction, remember all this talk about energy? Reducing my energy intake, it's going to make me live longer? Throw all those myths out the window. Now we're really in strange territory. Why should caloric restriction, and when I say caloric restriction, I'm not talking about keeping a nice normal weight, right? I'm talking about 30% less than a nice normal weight, right? Really severe reduction in calories. So Cynthia Kenyon finding that what caused her little roundworms to live longer was disrupting the insulin receptor, disabling the insulin receptor. Now, that should give some of you pause.
Well, I can't follow because I don't understand the relationship between the insulin receptor and
I'm
insulin
sorry.
receptor and obesity.
Okay, I'm sorry. Probably should have. How many of the rest of you lost a little bit on that? Okay.
It is complicated.
It's complicated. So insulin is a hormone, as you all probably know. It's a hormone secreted by our pancreas. I guess I'm assuming that because of the obesity epidemic and the consequent increase in diabetes, that this is becoming more of concern to the general public. But I'll explain quickly what the link is. What we knew about insulin until relatively recently, now we know much more about it, was that it's a hormone secreted by your pancreas in response to glucose in your blood, right? So when I eat, take up energy, it's going to end up as glucose in my blood, right? Or also if I'm converting, I can convert other food to insulin too. Insulin is now stimulated to be released. When insulin is released, that glucose that's in our blood can now be taken up by the cells that need it. Without that insulin, even if you eat, that food can't get into your cells. And that's what we call diabetes. Right?
The cells can't use the glucose as fuel.
They can't use the glucose as fuel without insulin.
Okay. So
present.
we produce insulin, but people who don't produce enough are diabetic.
Right. Well, so there's two forms
I mean,
of
that's what it
diabetes.
says.
In one case, what used to be called juvenile. Thank you. Juvenile. We now call it type 1. Juvenile diabetes. What happens is actually an autoimmune disease, and the body itself has destroyed the pancreas, so no insulin is going to be ever available. So those are also called insulin dependent. Right? The only way they can survive is by having insulin injections. The other form of diabetes, often an age-related disorder, people as they age are more likely to get diabetes. I'm not trying to struggle with the name we used to call it. Adult onset diabetes, right? So there was juvenile versus adult onset. Adult onset diabetes was a very different problem. No problem with insulin. Could produce insulin. The cells were deciding not to listen to insulin. You know, so you've got insulin, the cells are saying, not listening, not listening. Even though they need that glucose, they're not able to take it up. Right? So that's what's called insulin resistance. You've got the insulin, your cells aren't listening to it. And so that was called adult onset. We knew that it occurred as people age. We also knew that it was that there were two issues related. It's highly heritable, right? So there's a very large genetic component. But unlike what many people think about the relation between the genes and the environment, which is that it's either one or the other, right? But if you say something is a genetic disorder, you think, oh, well, then there's nothing I can do about it. I was born with it, right? Well, this is not often always the case. In fact, often not the case. Because it type 2, so, sorry, let's just write it down. So, juvenile, then I-L-E, there's no T there, but I have to process it. Juvenile is now called type 1. Adult onset is now called type 2. So I'm used to saying type 1 and type 2.
Isn't that because a lot of children are getting type
Yes,
2?
because now we're finding that many, many young children are coming down with adult onset. So we call that type 2, right? And we also, there is a very strong genetic component, but we also know that there's a very strong environmental component, right? We know that the rates of diabetes are growing very rapidly, and type 2 diabetes in many parts of the world, around the globe, are growing. That can't be a genetic change, right? And we also know that it's really closely linked to weight. The more overweight you are, the more likely you are to become diabetic.
But you can have type 2 without being obese?
Yes. You can, but your risk factors are much lower.
And it would be genetic, or who knows?
Well, no, it's that it's both. It's a genes and environment situation. You have to have the predisposition, but only in the face of a bad environment will you actually show up with the disorder.
What? Overweight? What's
Yes.
the sugar candy?
Right.
My father got diabetes as a result of taking a blood pressure medicine that didn't agree with him. The minute the doctor took him off his blood pressure medicine, his diabetes went away.
Wow. No, and there are also others. These aren't, I'm not covering the full range of
Lots of things.
Right, so insulin, we knew that insulin was a key regulator of metabolism. We knew it had something to do with appetite too. You know, one of the reasons why I feel hungry, why you all feel hungry, when you start thinking about the appetizers they might have out, you know, after we finish class, can suddenly make you start feeling really hungry. You know what's happening? You're mentally causing some insulin release, taking what little glucose is left from breakfast out of your blood. Most of the glucose that's in your blood is really meant for your brain, right? So the fact that your glucose starts dropping is going to be a signal that it's time to eat again, right? So you can release insulin just by thinking about food. And that's going to actually start making you feel more hungry because you're going to take the glucose out of your blood. Your brain's going to say, hey, there's not enough for me, go eat something.
Is that true? Your brain can release glucose?
Yes.
I mean,
Release
insulin.
Yes,
So you
absolutely.
can actually tell yourself to. No,
Well,
you can't.
it's not consciously.
Oh.
You know, you're just starting to, your mind's wandering, you're thinking about what might be for lunch, your glucose is going to be, insulin might be released.
Why do
Okay,
people
so
get
let me-
hungry when they're tired or haven't slept? And
Because
get
that may
sugar
be a
rush
signal
each
that
other?
your tiredness and so forth may be a signal that your energy reserves are low too, right? And, or your blood sugars are low, you're going to feel tired. So all of those might be clues.
Is there any relationship between leptin and insulin?
Yeah, there's a lot of relationships, right? And, you know, they're again, also very complex and so forth. So I know we're getting close to the time when both you're being hungry and probably tired. So let me try to quickly sort of tie a few more things together because they really are fascinating. Is that now, when she discovered insulin receptors, people still, you know, that was a really great idea because of the caloric restriction, but we didn't know much more than that. So, hey, maybe this is a way into understanding why caloric restriction increases lifespan. They started looking for the same gene in other animals, or they just said, okay, well, let's look for ancient genes in other animals. Let's not look for the same one. Let's just look and see what we find. Same genes kept popping up everywhere they looked. You look for a gene that causes an increase in lifespan in yeast, right? It's going to be related to the same pathway. You look for a gene that causes lifespan increase in fruit flies, the same pathway. Look for a gene that causes an increase in lifespan in mice, same pathway. I mean, it's like boom, 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 you know, the dominoes are falling.
They don't all have insulin. The pathway
No,
names,
well,
what does the pathway do?
the pathways are the insulin signaling pathways.
I mean, yeast needs insulin to turn glucose.
No,
into-
that's true. Yeast don't, but they have a pathway that allows them to monitor energy reserve. That evolutionarily is very related. No, in fact, it's a different, well, I should say that in yeast it's a different molecule. It's one you may have heard about, however, because it's gotten a lot of play in the public. You may not have heard of the molecule, but you've heard of what turns on that molecule. The molecule is called a sirtuin. What you've heard about that turns, so in this case it works a little differently. If you have more of the sirtuin, you live longer. Right? So now the researchers wanted to find something that would turn on the sirtuin. So they discovered the sirtuin in yeast. We now know that's in all organisms. Right? So it's present everywhere. Like the insulin pathway, it's involved in detecting energy levels. We need to monitor energy levels. And in sirtuin, so insulin and sirtuin are very closely related.
So what
and
is the chemical you've heard of?
What?
Please,
It's, the molecule that you've heard of is resveratrol.
Yes.
Okay? Resveratrol was a molecule, so they discovered sirtuins. They thought, we got to look for something that can turn sirtuin on. They did a mass search for chemicals, 10,000 chemicals. They came up with resveratrol.
Could you write that word on the board?
Yes, sirtuin.
That's the one that's in line.
Red wine.
And grapes. It's in
Right.
grapes.
And a pill. There's a pill. But they decided that pure resveratrol.
Yeah, you can buy it.
Can you write it?
Oh, sorry.
Good wine.
You know, they're putting that in face creams now, sirtuin. They're saying that that's an ingredient listed in face cream that's supposed to make your skin live longer.
Really?
I doubt it can be absorbed topically.
Although our skin does absorb a lot of stuff.
So you got some recipes?
I would just be, I mean, this is all upfront. They do not know how resveratrol does what it does currently. It was thought it directly activates sirtuins. We now know that it doesn't. Now that it does activate it indirectly, and so now it's been sort of revived again because they found that it is activated but indirectly, unlike what they first thought. What you need to turn on sirtuins is a huge, huge amount of this. So what they're selling is probably very questionable that's doing anything. Right? And the pharmaceutical companies are really looking for what they call small molecule activators that can act much more potently and do maybe what resveratrol is doing. But there's an interesting connection between what we do understand about resveratrol and caloric restriction that I want to get to just before we end. I'm going to compress a little bit of this. And that goes back to why I got sick when classes ended a little bit. Okay, maybe, somewhat. Which is, why should caloric restriction, first of all? Why should knocking out the insulin, I mean, if we knock out the insulin receptor in humans, you've got diabetes, right? You're not going to live longer. So that's a complication for humans because we're using insulin now for slightly different things. So we need to be a little more precise in the human body, or in mammalian bodies in general. But go ahead.
Well, when you restrict calories, you're putting your body under stress.
Yes.
And that actually releases this, I'm not sure what it is, but it does something
Yes.
to your body. So
Release sugar?
well,
Yeah.
it does something actually to the cellular level.
Yes.
And it actually protects it and
Right.
keeps it going.
It brings us very nicely back to this idea of why we want our bodies to be around anyway, right? To reproduce, right? So when would an animal ever face caloric restriction?
In a famine.
In a famine. Now, is a famine a very good time to reproduce?
No.
Okay, so stupid to put your energy into reproduction. What might be smart to do is, okay, so build that body up a little bit, right? Maybe you'll survive the famine, and then you'll be in a place where your energy can be used for reproduction again. So stress causes you to live longer.
What?
Stress causes what?
Well, this gets us very nice out of the conundrum of exercise, right? The reason exercise is good for us is that it stresses us, right? And how do organisms respond to stress? Building a stronger body. Stress can obviously become way beyond the level where it's beneficial.
Well, what do you
So
mean? I
I'm
mean,
not
mental
stressed.
stress or physical
What
stress?
about mental stress?
Right. They're different things.
Well, questionable. Again, there's always this line between good and bad, right?
I mean, you made a huge leap when you just said stress, right? Like,
Yes, I did. But when I say stress, here's one clue to what I mean. So this gets into a huge topic that's really fascinating called hormesis. And hormesis is the idea, it's a toxicological term that was used to describe the fact that usually when we look at a concentration reaction curve, right? The higher the concentration, the greater the reaction. You know, there's usually a nice linear reaction between linear again. So you expect to see some rational relationship between the input and the output, right? With some chemicals, they were finding that wasn't always the case when you work in biological organisms. That coming out of toxicology, looking at toxins, sometimes a small dose of a toxin actually makes you stronger or healthier. So you can get a curve that looks like this, right? Well, I should turn it the other way around.
Isn't that the rationale for homeopathy?
It is the rationale. That's way too much. It is the rationale for homeopathic medicine, and that's why for a very long time hormesis was stay away from that. We don't want to get tainted with the lunacy of homeopathy. But it is true that a little toxin can in fact make you stronger because it turns on stress pathways in the cell that are needed to make that cell stronger, right? If you put a fruit fly in a hot environment, that kills it, or that could, and you take the few that, for whatever reason aren't killed, take that back again, in an environment that you know would kill them. Put them in an environment that's not quite that hot so that they can survive. Let them stay there for a while, take them back out. Now put them in that hot environment that would have killed them initially, they're doing okay, right? And what they've done is generate a lot of what is called heat shock proteins. You turn on a whole genetic program that allows you to survive that stress, okay? And that's what exercise does.
You know, this was
What
often
about,
expected.
what about, what would mental stress do?
So there's a question about food, and you were asking about recipes? Because in the reading there was this point about why we eat organic food.
Exactly.
And why it's so good for us is because the stress that the plants go under when they're not protected.
You did a very
by
good
all-
job reading.
Well,
Good.
this
Well,
last
good.
night, so
Good.
it's still in my brain. But the reason we eat organic food is because, and it's good for us, is because they're not protected by all of the, the pesticides and other things that grown in a perfect environment. They're grown in a less than perfect environment and stressed, and that stress gets into their cells, and then when we ingest it, we benefit from it.
Right. So when do plants produce more resveratrol? When they're under stress. Okay? And so when I eat a plant that's been stressed a bit, it's going to cause me to activate my sirtuins. And now I'm going to get the benefit of that stress protection in spite of having not been stressed myself. This is actually a very seriously proposed idea. It's speculation. It hasn't been fully tested yet. But resveratrol is a chemical that's produced when plants are stressed. Another chemical produced when plants are stressed that I bet you've taken in your recent history, aspirin. Okay? So in looking at many of the chemicals that we use from plants, right, that are beneficial to us as medicines, turn out to be chemicals that are produced in plants when they're stressed. These are all called secondary metabolites.
It sort of puts me in mind of cannibals who think they're going to ingest the courage of the people they devour.
Isn't that a very interesting idea? Right. So maybe it's coming out of some real observations they made about nature. They may be misapplying them a bit, but maybe it's based on.
But I'd like to go back to her question about psychological stress as opposed to physical stress.
I think, again, when we think about psychological stress, we're often thinking about the kind of psychological stress that is debilitating. Chronic stress that doesn't really, what we call psychological stress is really feeling out of control, right, for whatever reason. That's the definition of stress, when you feel that you're not able to control what you need to control, right? A stress that allows you to control it, however, we often find invigorating. Right? If I've got a challenge that I feel up to, that's often very invigorating. I enjoy it and so forth. That's a stress also. It's a stress if you define it by looking at the hormones that are produced in your body. Both kinds will produce the hormone cortisol. Right? In one case, cortisol is helping you, sort of focus the energy you need to do the project that you want to do. In the other case, when it becomes chronic and you can't ever resolve it, if it's around for a long time, it's going to cause a lot of damage, right? It's one of those that are, that have this sort of dual effect. That's what I ended up having to take this week. I take stress hormone, right? Many of you have probably had to do that too, right? Taking a cortisol-based hormone to help your body sort of deal with what you have to do.
But if obesity is such a terrible thing, why do we have since people are getting more and more obese, why do we have so much overpopulation?
Right. Well, there are people who are really demographers who told me that they were not a demographer. Yeah, is that what I'm thinking of? Actuarial. You said you did people who do actuarial charts. Insurance companies who figure out your
Now
risk.
what they're doing is incorporating exercise programs as
Into that,
mandatory,
right.
so that in the forthcoming health care,
Right.
people are doing
To increase
more,
metabolism.
to encourage passive,
Right.
encourage more active
Right.
participants.
Yeah. So let me tell you, and maybe we can sort of end here. There's, could go on for quite a while, but the problem. Right. Yeah. So. To get back to the exercise, and someone said when I asked first about aging, answered by saying oxidation. Was that you?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so one of the this is a whole other piece of the aging theory that I didn't really go into, but I want to bring it back quickly and talk about exercise. which is that, and it's a well-established and probably very solid finding that what happens when we burn glucose, inside our cells on a molecular level, is that we release these chemicals that are called free radicals. And free radicals are very damaging, right? And we try to protect ourselves from free radicals by other chemicals that are called antioxidants. Antioxidants are something you probably hear about all the time, right? Free radicals too nervy. So the idea is we produce these free radicals, they make a mess out of our cells. Over time, that's what really causes aging, right? Antioxidants will prevent that, so let's gobble up the antioxidants, right? Well, there's certainly they're being pushed everywhere. Well, here's an experiment that was done 2 years ago now, I think. Greg, you need to go. I don't want to hold anybody up if they need to go.
No, I can stay.
This will take about a minute to tie it up, but it's.
You're about to tell us how to become immortal. I'm staying.
We got time. We're not hungry.
I'm not going to lunch.
Yeah, so jelly beans we can pass around. Did a study looking at the benefits of exercise, taking two groups. One group, both in the same group exercise. One group just exercised, the other group exercised, and they took vitamin C and vitamin E. Common supplements that people use because they think they work, or A or E, I'm not remembering exactly which one's A and C. Guess which group did better?
The ones without vitamins.
Without vitamins. Why?
Stress.
The way we benefit from exercise is the stress that is caused in our muscle cells. Antioxidants block that stress signal, we don't get the benefit. Right? So the stress, right, we need to hear the stress to be able to respond to it. By taking antioxidants, our body cannot hear that stress signal that causes us to get stronger.
Well, I'm very stressed because, there's that part that says, you've got to be calm, you've got to do the deep breathing, whatnot.
That's
and my 96-year-old mother is constantly screaming at me and rushing me, and I guess she's got the right thing going. She's always rushing, and, she's way ahead of me. I can't get up there mentally. It's like, could you slow down?
Yeah, as I said, the other course I take, psychoneuroimmunology, is all about stress. Right? So that's a whole other talk. But it's really, as you said, a psychological thing. I can't say that this thing is stressful. I have to know how you react to it. Right? What's stressful for one person may be fun for another person. Right, so.
But what you're saying is that you should have to want a certain amount of stress.
A certain amount of stress.
And then stress is something, by definition, that you don't want, that is uncomfortable. So you're saying to keep yourself a bit uncomfortable.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe to say trying to avoid all stress is not the way to go.
Stay busy, don't just sit around being
Yeah.
busy.
Feel challenged, feel invigorated.
Two kinds of stress.
Or upset even. Are you saying even upset?
Voice stress is positive stress and distress is negative stress. There's voice stress, like sexual excitement, is also a body stressor, but most people want it. It's an all stress.
Yes. So I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. My job is to be the wet blanket. We need to be sure that you get to your next program.
Oh, it's not a lunch show.
Yeah. It is lunch.
Well, it's lunch, and it's telling us we shouldn't take vitamins.
It's really a controversial subject right now.
Oh.
It's really controversial. It's been controversial for a long time.
Two more questions.
Yeah.
Two more questions.
Sure, I'm willing to answer more questions if anyone wants to stay. I just don't want to hold
Thank
anyone
God,
up if they have
some
other.
people who are living into their 90s, they're not terribly fit necessarily.
No,
and you need, I would think that, when you do come down with something, you need some reserve.
Yeah, and one of the papers that